Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast that explores the Great Resignation. I'm your host, Brian Akar. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the reasons they decided to leave their jobs during the pandemic and what has happened since. Hello, and thanks for tuning into this episode of the Why I Left podcast. In today's episode, I chat with Billy Lahr. Billy is a former educator with 20 plus years of classroom and administration experience. He is also the host of the Mindful Midlife Crisis Podcast, which he created to help people navigate the complexities and possibilities of life's second half. I'm excited for him to share his story and really enjoyed our discussion. Let's go check it out. All right, welcome back. So our guest today is Billy Lahr. Billy has a riveting story about being an educator during COVID and what ultimately led him to pivoting out of the profession and into podcasting. Now, I've always wanted to hear an educator's point of view during these times because they got hit really hard during the shutdowns. So I'm excited to have him share more about what it was like, why he resigned, and learn more about the conversations he now facilitates on his show. So hi, Billy. How you doing today?
Doing well, Brian. Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate you joining. So prior to us getting into, this pivot that you underwent during the pandemic, tell us a little bit about your upbringing and where you call home.
Well, so that's a tricky one for me now because I am transitioning into this digital nomad lifestyle that I didn't really think that I would ever get into because I'm someone who likes structure and I like regiment. I like routine. That's why I worked in a profession that had bells that told me when and where to go, right? So right now I am stationed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Twin Cities area, bouncing around from couch to couch here the last couple months because I spent the previous 3 months in Korea. So I spent 2 months in Seoul. I did 10 days in Jeju Island. I was in Busan for a week and then did a long weekend in Gangneum. And I liked it so much that in October, I'm heading back. I actually just got an email now that said that the financing for the buyer of my condo has been approved. So
wow.
I'm heading back to Korea. I just really had such a positive experience there with the people that I met. And I've lived in Minnesota my whole life. Why not now? I'm not married. I don't have any kids. This is the time to do it for me. So this felt like a natural point in my life. I just turned 45. Why not make this transition? And that's a big reason why I host a podcast called the Mindful Midlife Crisis, because that's sort of where I am right now, but I'm trying to do it mindfully. I'm trying to make this transition mindfully.
Absolutely. And that's awesome. And congratulations. That should be a lot of fun. And we're going to definitely talk about your show because I'm very, very interested in the topic that you're discussing there. So now, what have been some of the things that you've been passionate about professionally? Obviously, you've been a teacher, as I mentioned, for a long time, but what got you into that? And what are some of the passions that drove you in that profession?
I remember at my 10-year high school reunion, a classmate of mine came up to me and said, "Lahr, I'm not surprised that you became a teacher." And I'm like, "What?" And he said, "Listen, I could have told you in third grade that you were going to become a teacher." So I feel like, I guess that's always been my calling. Now, interestingly enough, I went to college for computer programming. That lasted about 2 weeks because I was enrolled in calculus and I was enrolled in Fortran programming, and I was not good at either one of those. And I remember going back and visiting my high school baseball coach one weekend, and he was teaching health, and he said, "Hey, do you want to teach this lesson today?" And I'm like, "Yeah, what is it?" He said, "It's 10 leading causes of death." And I'm like, "Oh, I remember that from 10th grade." Yeah. So I led this discussion and it just felt really natural. It felt organic. I had always been a little league coach, a t-ball coach leading up to that as well. So this idea of helping people and having conversations that inspire learning and inspire growth and inspire reflection, I guess has always come naturally to me. And it's something that I've always enjoyed. I guess I'm kind of contrarian in a lot of ways too. So I like to push people on their beliefs and get them to think about life in a different way, while in turn having them challenge my beliefs and my structures and challenge me too to reframe and look at things differently. So, going into education, I loved English, I loved reading, I liked talking about literature. I just really enjoyed the symbolism and a good story. I love a good story. I like setting up a good story. I pour my heart and soul into the podcast so that it flows like a story. So that's just something that I gravitate towards and that I enjoy, because a good story is emotionally appealing. And I think that's another thing about me, is that I like to tap into the emotions of a story, and I want people to feel the emotions of a story. I want them to have this catharsis along with the character. I find that, like, I'm a crier in movies. I'm absolutely a crier. So I'm not ashamed to admit that. But I just find that to be such a eye-opening experience, to be able to see a story unfold and then turn that lesson into your own growth. And that's what I want to help people do moving forward. Working in education, I started to lose that passion, because you don't always have the same buy-in from the students. Because you don't, I mean, if I'm coaching, a lot of times they're coming to me because what I'm saying or what I'm doing resonates with them, and they feel like I can provide them some support. You don't always get that in school. Actually, rarely do you get that when you're a teacher. You have to be able to work with a lot of different personalities, and it was wearing me out. And when I transferred into being a dean of students, you're always the bad guy when you're the dean of students. Nobody likes the dean of students. They make movies about the dean of students, and the dean of students is always the villain. And I mean, I just didn't enjoy being that. So it was time for me to take a break. And so I took a leave, and now here I am a year later, moving halfway around the world.
Oh, wow. And so prior to launching your own show, tell us about your work journey and really what's worked well in the environments that you've been a part of.
It's funny. I actually, right before this call, I was talking to a former student of mine because she was interested in being a guest on the show. And her experience in my class, and interestingly enough, I taught a class called Humanity's Search for Meaning. So maybe I've just been destined to have this Mindful Midlife Crisis podcast and help people navigate and find purpose and find meaning. And that class sort of set me on its way. But that class particularly was the reason why I woke up every single morning, because I loved teaching that class. It was an elective class. Students came there to be challenged, not just by me, but by each other as well. So that was a really positive experience. When I moved from Rochester, Minnesota to the Twin Cities, I moved into an alternative program, and students were coming to me with a bunch of different social, emotional, behavioral, mental barriers that were getting in the way of their enjoyment of learning. And at that time, I was not in a good place mentally. I was really struggling with anxiety. I was struggling with depression. I was struggling with suicidal ideation. Those students needed a pillar of emotional support, and I was not that guy. And I also don't think that I had enough experience to navigate what they were bringing into a classroom, because I grew up on a farm in West Central Minnesota. So I didn't have a lot of experiences that these students had. So, at the end of the day, I might not have been the best teacher for them for so many reasons, But they in turn were really good teachers for me. because then I did start to develop a better understanding of how to work with a variety of people who are coming in with different needs. So that really challenged me, and it taught me to get creative. And I think what burned me out in the classroom was the fact that I had 3 different classes that I had to prepare for. If I had 2, I think I could have really focused a little bit more, but I had 3 different classes that I was preparing for, and you're just constantly shifting from one mindset to the other. I mean, really, you're creating 3 85-minute presentations every single day with the expectation that they're walking away from that presentation learning all of the material, and then you got to do that 5 days a week. So it was really, really challenging and stressful. And when this dean of students position came about, I thought to myself, well, here would be an opportunity for me to work with a broader student base and to work with and really do more with shaping the climate and culture of the building. And I thought that I was going to have a bigger impact than what I had. And unfortunately, it just didn't work out. A lot of my job revolved around discipline, and I just lost any passion for that. And so I took the leave. I'd always wanted to take a leave and travel. That was something that was really important to me. And then when I came back, I realized that there wasn't going to be a way for me to transition back into that dean position. So I just said, I resign.
Wow. And I appreciate you sharing what you did. One, you are very self-aware, right? So I hear that through
almost
and through.
To a fault. And I'll tell you that I once had a person tell me, it must be physically exhausting thinking as much as you do. And I'm like, yes, it is. Like, that's absolutely, it is exhausting, but it also helps me sort out a lot of the thoughts. But that's also too why I practice mindfulness. I always tell people that I practice mindfulness so I can be this level of intensity, because if I didn't practice mindfulness, I would be off the charts obnoxious.
Got it. So that's interesting. And I'm a big mindfulness fan myself as well. Me and the kids always meditating at night, through the Peloton app, which we love. So that's our thing. So I want to take you back to March of 2020, right? And I know we're a couple years removed now, but still, I think it is something that is, especially given the tone of the show, it's something that people really, I don't think we're ever going to forget about kind of what happened over these past few years. So let's go back to March 2020. COVID is introduced. Who knows what it was going to be at that time, right? But describe a little bit how the pandemic affected you.
It's interesting when, I knew you were going to ask me this, and it really took a lot of hard work for me to remember what that was like, because I almost feel like I pushed that experience out of my head because it didn't feel like it served me any longer to be in my head. So as I'm recalling it, I just remember a lot of time on Zoom and scheduling time as a team with me as a dean, our social worker, our associate principal, and a counselor, working with students who had just checked out academically. And some of them were checking out emotionally, mentally, because that this transition was really difficult. It reminded me of all the conversations that I had with students who hated school and said, I just want to do online school. And I'm like, online school requires a lot more discipline than being at school, because being at school, there are going to be people who are holding you accountable. Online school, it's just you. And I think a lot of students realized, well, online school doesn't really feel like school. And we had a system in place that it was, I feel like administration, this was the first time that they had ever done this. They really did the best that they could in order to create a sustainable learning environment, but it was just really hard. It was really hard to figure it out, and teachers were stressed out about it. I was stressed out about it because I enjoy the energy of being around people. So not being around people and not feeling the hum of the building, as as draining as that din, that low roar can be, it's still at the same time kind of energizing too, especially if you're in an office with your colleagues. So it was a really draining time because I've constantly felt from March until the end of May, felt like I was in a losing battle with students. I didn't experience a lot of successes. In fact, students who were doing well during the first 6 months of the school year, names that I'll be honest, it's the largest high school in Minnesota. There's 3,700 students in the building, 9 through 12. I didn't know every student in the building. But then there would be names that would pop up where I'm like, whoa, like I know this name, but this name hasn't ever showed up in terms of like it as a struggling student or that sort of thing. So these names would pop up, and then more names that I wasn't aware of would pop up. And spending a lot of time creating very structured plans that I felt were going to help these students be successful, and then they not follow through with them. And so it kind of brings me back to a conversation I had the other day with a realization that were we spending too much time on trying to get them to do the work and not enough time focusing on teaching them how to navigate this pandemic, the emotional toll of the pandemic. And I don't know that we did enough for teachers in that regard as well. At the same time, I'm not faulting anybody for that. You don't know what you don't know. And we've never been in a situation like this. So I just felt like it was going to be a lose-lose situation all around. And then when the next school year rolled around, we went to a hybrid system. But because I was a dean, I was in the building every single day. And we had students who were identified as receiving special ed services, and students that we identified as, you absolutely need to be in the building, because if you're not, you're gonna really struggle academically. And then we had courses like your hands-on courses. So anything that was a wood shop course, or anything that was a home ec course, a cooking course, if it was a painting course, something like that, they would come into the building every other day. So then those students had to go somewhere when it was their math class or their social studies class or their English class. So they would go down to the cafeteria, and very strict. You need to sit on where the dots are on the chairs, and you can't get up and move. And so then it just became herding cats for hours and hours, week after week. And that just drained me, because kids don't want to sit still. Kids want to socialize, especially if they hadn't seen their friends. And if they do have friends that are in the building, yes, they're absolutely going to want to sit with their friends, and they're not going to. It's funny how especially teenage boys just have no idea of social space awareness. Like they just want to be just around each other and shoving and pushing, and that's just, their chemical makeup. But that was really, really difficult to walk around, and like I said, it just felt like I was herding cats. So I'm glad that I got out when I did, because this past school year, I think the emotional toll hit teachers, and the lack of structure hit students this past year. And I had a lot of friends who are in education say you picked the right year to take a leave.
Yeah, look, I vividly remember what remote learning was like as a parent. So I have two small boys, right? 6 and 4. Well, now they're 6 and 4 at the time, 4 and 2. And, I was so interested when I found you online, just to hear that educator's point of view about your experience, right? So what would you say is like the top 3 things you learned during that time?
I think one thing I learned is just how important regiment and structure is for students. and allowing flexibility within that, but consistent structure and regimen for younger people is really, really important. And then creating some autonomy, creating some flexibility within that as well. But then even when you do create that, it's always seen it as you're holding me back, or this feels like a prison. It's like, oh my gosh, like, do you understand how much flexibility you really have in all of this? So again, it a lot of times it feels like a losing battle. And I think I'm a little bit more jaded coming out of it, just having been on the discipline end of things. And so I feel like maybe I did have to do a lot of healing from that. I think in this reflection over this past year, I had to forgive myself even for the mistakes that I made as a dean, where, maybe are there times when I could have helped students better? Yeah, absolutely. Could I have been more collaborative with my team? Yeah, absolutely. So again, just kind of recognizing that, you made mistakes in this, and not beat myself up, but at the same time, learn from that too, and recognize, okay, if you don't know how to do something, who are you reaching out to? Who are you connecting with so that you can get some sense of support? And I think that was a key thing too that I learned. My associate principal and that's, we tell each other that we love each other because that's how close we are. Like, I gave the toast at her wedding because we're that close. So it was really important for me to find somebody in the building who I could go to if I was stressed out, or if I just needed to process something, or if I didn't understand, or to tag out. If I had been working with a student and that student had driven me up the wall for the 800th time, just tapping out and saying, can you talk to the student today? Because I can't. Like, knowing myself and saying, well, if I talk to this kid, I'm going to lose my mind, and then it's going to get real bad. So I'm going to tap out. Can you have this conversation today? I'll be in the room so that I can watch you talk to the student and get a better understanding of what's going on with them. But I'm just going to sit and I'm going to be a listener. So I think that was another big takeaway for me too. And the last takeaway is that our teachers worked really hard. They worked really, really hard. Our administrators worked really hard. And listen, again, I'm sure they made mistakes, but they also worked really, really hard, and they had students' best interest at heart while doing a really difficult task, which was maintaining their own mental health while navigating a pandemic that we've never seen before. So I think it wasn't ideal for anybody. It wasn't ideal for parents, particularly parents of little kids, with them at home having to do work while they're at their job. It wasn't ideal in any way. Teachers who had little kids were in the same situation, trying to teach while also making sure that the house didn't burn down around them with their child at home. I do think that there's going to be, unfortunately, some long-term trauma. And when I say trauma, I mean little t trauma that comes out from this, which is why I think it's going to be so important that we focus on things like interpersonal skills and emotional intelligence moving forward, particularly with this school age group of children.
I agree. And look, there's a lot going on in Minnesota during the pandemic, right? And so from pandemic, political, social unrest, a lot of things happening. So I'm sure it was starting to compound. So how did the pandemic really start? And you've been, talking about it a little bit here too, but how did it start to affect your relationship with your job now?
I don't think the pandemic impacted it any more than the previous years. Like I said, when you're the bad guy, you're the bad guy. So, and I think part of that too is the level of intensity that I bring to any given situation. I have a high expectation that that you're going to reciprocate that. Now that's on me, because if I'm having that expectation, I also need to understand that people might not live up to those expectations. And you get caught up and wrapped up in the moment, and you default to mindsets that may not serve you. And over time, I know that I would just get frustrated being in positions where I felt like I was having the same conversation with students over and over again. Why are you doing this? Why are you being a knucklehead? That kind of thing. Why are you not turning in your assignments? We outlined a beautiful plan for you to turn in these assignments, and you didn't follow through with this. Why didn't you come and get some academic support with this after school program that I developed so that you can get this stuff turned in? So some of it, I think, is learned helplessness, and some of it is just a sense of pride. Like, I'm not going to go in and admit that I don't know something. And I think that was really strong within students. And over time, I could feel that weighing on me and wearing me out. So it was just time to go. I had to, it was just time to take a leave. And then I didn't see myself being able to smoothly transition back into that position and enjoying it. And listen, if you don't have a passion to work in education, you absolutely should not be working in education. And so that was my realization. Like, when people were like, "Oh, are you going to Korea to teach English?" No, I'm not going to Korea to teach English. I'm going to Korea to find another job, to carve out a different path, because I did that for 21 years. Now I want to find out what else I'm good at. So for me, it's not in any way, shape, or form an eat, pray, love type of situation, because I really dislike that book. But but it is, for me, pushing myself to figure out what it is that I am good at and reframe all the transferable skills that I had as an educator to now work with adults and connect with them that way. Because I feel, even though I don't have kids and I've never been married, I still feel like the thoughts that I have and the behaviors that I have had are all things that created limits to my potential. And I feel like I'm on the other side of that. And I also feel like I can work with people who maybe are in the same place that I once was. So I want to bring awareness to that so that they can see how those thoughts and behaviors are getting in the way of feeling happy, healthy, and loved.
Makes sense. And now, you mentioned this earlier about how some of your colleagues have mentioned, Lahr, you got out at the right time, right? And so what would you say are like the top, let's say, 5 stressors that educators are experiencing now as a result of the pandemic?
I think it's workload, just the shifting workload and managing new technology and, new LMSs that they might not be familiar with. You have to adapt, but I think especially for teachers who haven't, who have just kind of been able to get by and are still engaging, but now have to move to a new platform, I think that was really challenging for a lot of teachers, learning that while still also creating meaningful lessons and meaningful material for students to learn. And then I think, secondly, figuring out a way to engage the disengaged in a new way, because you're able to do it a little easier when you're in person. I mean, you can use proximity in order to re-engage a student, or at least gauge whether or not they understand the material, see where they are in the process. But when you're doing that remotely, especially if kids have their cameras off, or if the cameras are tilted up, or what have you, or if they're in their bedroom where there's a million more entertaining things than you as a teacher, like, yeah, I can only imagine how difficult that was. I think as students started to come back in, like I said, that lack of structure, that lack of routine, and not knowing how to do school because they've been out of that routine for a while, having them come back in, teachers would tell me all the time that behaviors were off the charts this past year, that referrals were off the charts in this past year. So I'm glad I missed that. I'm glad that I was away from that. I think parents had unrealistic expectations of what they demanded of their teachers. Now, this is always the case, but I think even more so during this time. But I imagine that parents were also just in survival mode too, because if they're trying to work from home, they have their child just over in the other room, I imagine they're thinking to themselves, for the love of everything holy, I just want this teacher to keep them engaged the entire time so that I can focus on my work. So I get it. I absolutely get it. At the same time, there were some parents who had extremely unrealistic expectations of the administration and of teachers too. And I think the last thing, just fear around catching COVID. I mean, we had teachers who just did not want to come into the building when we came back hybrid. And like, as someone who had to be in the building every single day and had to be in the cafeteria with hundreds of students, I didn't like hearing that. So I think that then there became a division between staff, particularly, and I mean, you think about the political climate, and of course you're going to have that in there too. So I remember doing our Zoom staff meetings and hearing teachers talk about feeling unsafe about coming into the building, and all they had to do was come into the building and not interact with anybody, go straight to their classroom. They didn't have any students in there. They just needed to be present in the building, and they felt unsafe about that. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Like, I'm going down 3 times a day and spending 30 minutes with students while they are and herding them like cats, and then going down there for lunch for 50 minutes. And while their masks are down, and who knows what, who they're interacting with, that kind of thing. So that was really, really frustrating as well. So that fear of coming into the building and the unknown and the fear of COVID, but then also the divide amongst the staff. And listen, I get it. I was super cautious about COVID. And then I think, like everybody else, I got COVID fatigue. I was like, if I get it, I get it, right. But not really comprehending that if I got it, then I was putting other people at risk too. So it became selfish.
So now in November of 2021, you decided, look, my time is done here in education. And so, why ultimately did you leave your job during the pandemic?
Like I said, there just wasn't going to be a way for me to transition back into that position. And I floundered then for months to figure out what I was going to do. And that was a really challenging point in my life. Like, if you actually listen to season 5 of our podcast, you can hear it in my voice. Like, you can hear the distress in my voice. So I knew that I couldn't go back to working that job, but I also was struggling with now what, and I talking about stories. We did our summer sessions for the podcast where I just talked about my travels in 2022, and I set it up where I talk about what my mental state was in January when I was in the Pacific Northwest and how things just kind of progressed to this point in time in my life where I am very clear on what it is that I want. And that ultimately, that isn't what I was thinking at the time. But if I always had that job lingering in the background, I think, it would have been like a safety net. And I just wanted to go all in. Like, I knew I had to go all in, and I went all in on resigning with and listen, I don't recommend that, but I've done that before. When I left Rochester in 2007, I didn't have a teaching job lined up for the following school year, but I knew that I no longer wanted to be in Rochester. I knew I no longer wanted to live there. I wanted to live in the Twin Cities. So I resigned from that position and threw caution to the wind and hoped for the best. And luckily I found a position at a new school. And, the next 14 years of my life were the most challenging years of my life. Now, is that because I didn't have a plan? I don't know. I also think that was a component of just a lack of maturity when between the ages of 30 and 38, particular. What am I talking about? But lack of maturity from 20 to 38, where I didn't really invest in myself and ran on privilege and entitlements, and didn't really think of the consequences of my actions because I was having a good old time. But then that led to, all right, now that you're in this challenging situation, how do you deal with it? And I was so used to getting my way that when things weren't going my way, then I acted out, and that manifested into anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation.
Yeah. And now you'd mentioned earlier that you had also started to lose your passion for teaching. And so what was that pivotal moment when you realized that the passion was gone?
So as a dean, I had endured a lot of social media harassment to the point where I had to involve the police because it was rampant. So that whole experience just really soured me in terms of ever wanting to work with teenagers again. I think the realization that I didn't want to go back into education, it probably hit me. It was building up, but it became crystal clear the last 2 weeks I was in Korea. And I remember waking up one day and thinking to myself, why am I investing so much time and energy into people and things that do not reciprocate the same time and energy into me? And so I just thought about, what is it that I've invested so much time and energy into that isn't reciprocating, that isn't bringing me joy, that isn't bringing me happiness? And teaching was one of those things. Well, let me put it this way. Teaching in a high school was one of those things. I still enjoy teaching. I still enjoy presenting. I like doing those things. I still enjoy creating lessons, but I want my audience to change now. And so that's why I love doing the podcast. The podcast gives me an opportunity to engage with people that I never thought that I would ever engage with. Like, I highly doubt you and I would have ever had a conversation. And, I've invited you to be on my show, and there's a lot of people that I've encountered over the past year and a half that we've been doing the podcast that I couldn't imagine that I would have ever met. And they have expanded my emotional growth significantly, to the point where, like, if I hadn't been having those conversations with people, well, I don't know that I would be as clear on the direction that I want to go now. So I'm truly grateful for that. And so, just getting back to your original question, the joy started to die the more that I had to endure this social media harassment. But because I I guess in a sense, I have this idealistic mind, this realistic idealism is what I like to call it. I have this realistic idealism where I still thought that I was making a difference. And I don't think I was seeing a return on that investment. And so I just said, it's got to be time. And when I was in Korea, it became real crystal clear that I know exactly what I do not want any more of in my life.
And so now you were in Korea for a little bit. Now, so tell us a little bit more about what has happened since you left.
So I took a leave in September. That's how it started. And I went to Portugal for 2 months. And if you can get to Portugal, go, because it's beautiful. I love Portugal. That's where I want to spend my 50s and 60s and 70s. No bluer skies you'll ever find in the world. Portugal is absolutely amazing. Then I went to Spain for 2 weeks. One of my goals is to paddleboard off the coast of every continent. So I took a flight from Madrid to Dakar, Senegal, paddleboarded off the coast of Africa, and then came back to the States just to kind of regroup for 6 weeks. Went and stayed with my sister in Seattle, went to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico for a month, came back to the States for a month, and then went to Seoul for 3 months. And, just that whole experience reinforced this idea that it's a great big world out there. Why have I only been living in Minnesota my whole life? And it comes down to FOMO. Like I felt like I was going to miss out. And what was I missing out on? Well, I've been missing out on really great cultural experiences around the world, thinking that, and investing in all my time in experiences here in Minnesota. And I love Minnesota when it's not snowing. So it just dawned on me that there's a lot more to this world. And what's interesting is that being back in Minnesota now here for the last month, I've been able to bury myself in work for the podcast, which has been fine because I really enjoy it, because there aren't very many experiences here that I haven't had or that I'm longing to have. But I do feel pulled back to Seoul. And I'm really looking forward to that opportunity.
No, that's great. And so it sounds like you've learned a lot about yourself throughout this process, and you've mentioned, a little bit about your show. And so tell us more about Mindful Midlife Crisis, the podcast.
Yeah, we started off as my friend Brian. We call him Brian on the bass because he plays bass in every band in the Twin Cities. So I approached him. I've had this title in my head for a while, and I thought it was going to be my next great American novel, but I couldn't sit down and put it into words. And I thought, well, I really do enjoy podcasts. Maybe I could do a podcast. And Brian's got all this amazing mic equipment. And I was like, man, would you want to do this mental health podcast with me? And he said, yeah, I've got a degree in communications and psychology. That sounds awesome. So he was the perfect person to do it. And he and I just really riff off of each other. And as I kind of outlined the show, I realized that, well, if our niche is just mental health, this is going to be a little bit harder. And if it's called the Mindful Midlife Crisis, what are things that people between the ages of 35 and 55 are navigating right now? Not necessarily struggling, but navigating. So we have people come on and talk about relationships. We have people come on and talk about parenting in a blended family, or how to co-parent with your ex in a way that is mutually respectful. We have people come on and talk about compassionate communication for deeper, more meaningful relationships. We have people come on and talk about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion everywhere we go. We had Carrie Schweer come on and talk about gray area drinking, which I thought was it was a really fascinating conversation. We had someone come on and talk about how to revive your midlife marriage. Deanna Bryant, she came on and talked about that. So a lot of it is relationships. A lot of it is also emotional intelligence. We had Rich Bracken come on and talk about how he uses being a DJ in order to communicate emotional intelligence during his presentations. And that was a lot of fun. It felt like a punk rock song all the way through because the information just came really fast. Tom Cody has been on a couple times. We really enjoy him. He has a company called Top 20 Strategies, and they talk about social emotional wellness. And we wanted to focus around those interpersonal skills and the social emotional wellness. And we wanted to promote mindfulness. We wanted to promote communication because we feel like if people take these skills and take these strategies from our guests and apply them just here and there throughout their life, that they're actually going to experience more happiness, more health, more love in their life. We talked to a couple different people about fitness because as you get older, you lose muscle mass. And so it's important for us to continue going to the gym and strength training and doing hypertrophy training as we get older. That's really important because if we don't use it, we're going to lose it. And so how do we continue to maintain health as we age? And you're seeing people 35 to 55 particularly, they need to be more mindful of their health because unless you're planning on spending all sorts of money on surgeries or medication, hey, the simple fix just might be taking care of your body now and making that a routine. So those were things that we wanted to focus on, which is how do you navigate the complexities and possibilities of life's second half?
I like that a lot. And, you'd mentioned something earlier about how, obviously how we met and what having a podcast does for your network and just getting a chance to meet a bunch of great people. Right. And I can attest to that as I've, started this show, at the time this is airing, we will have, we've already been through season 1. Right. And so we're well into season 2 now. And so it's awesome to hear you say that because I'm now experiencing that for myself. And one of the aspects of our show is really around that advice for others piece. And so one of the things I would love for you to share is and maybe, specifically to education, but it could be broad, right? But what advice would you give to our listeners who may have a similar experience to yours, but really don't know what to do next?
Well, just kind of going off your last point there, we always talk about how your network equals your net worth and how important building social connections are because you might need to make that lateral moves at some point in life, or you might need to make that transition at some point in your life. Who do you know that can help you with that? And, how do you start that conversation if you haven't spoken to somebody for years? My podcast hero is Jordan Harbinger, and Jordan Harbinger has a 6-minute course and it's completely free, 100% free. And it's a networking course and it tells you how to do things like that. And I started doing the things in there and just kind of reaching out to people in my phone that I hadn't talked to in a while, but doing it in a genuine way to reestablish connection, reestablish a network so that, here I am now trying to grow this podcast. I'm not just right out the gate saying, hey, I know we haven't talked in 2 years, but I've got this podcast and why don't you listen to it and leave a rating, that sort of thing. Like you kind of build up to that. And he's got a great way of teaching people how to do that. So I think that idea of your network equals your net worth is really, really important. As far as for people in education, as much as I value mindfulness, I want to caution people, particularly administrators. So this is for administrators. If you think you could just sprinkle a little mindfulness on it, that's not going to help. That's not going to help because that might help internally, but there's so many systemic changes that need to be made, not just in education, but in society as a whole, that we need a more mindful society in order to make those changes. But we shouldn't expect that sprinkling a little mindfulness is going to make those changes. Mindfulness needs to be intentional. And then once we develop that awareness and once we develop that focus and that intention, then systemic change can be intentional and focused and directed as well. So I'm not saying don't practice mindfulness. What I'm saying is don't use mindfulness as a band-aid. Do it with intention, do it with focus, do it for yourself. If you're an administrator saying, well, let's just give them more mindful opportunities, are you doing mindfulness? Because if you're not doing it, stop sprinkling it amongst your staff.
Makes sense. And I think that's a good lesson for employers as a whole as well, right? Not even administrators, but as a whole. And so now in this next chapter of your career, what type of impact are you hoping to have in your professional life as a podcaster or wherever else it may take you?
Well, allow me to shamelessly promote myself. Now, my friend Jill Daylor, she is a certified coactive life coach. She and I are working on a program called Reflect, Learn, Grow. And I'll send the information to you so that way if people are interested, they can check out the landing page and sign up for more information about that as well. And the purpose of it is we're actually going to use data points based on personality profile tests and perceived stress tests and mindful awareness assessments in order to help people see how they perceive their stress levels, how they perceive their default personalities, so that we can then use those in order to move towards more awareness towards thoughts and behaviors that are not just self-limiting, but are also self-excelling. Because I feel like too often we focus on the self-limiting. We need to also focus on the self-excelling, where our strengths are. And we're building this 6-month course so that people can use this new awareness and learn these skills, develop these skills, and grow from these skills so that they can have a more purpose-filled and successful, however they want to define it, life. And we're really excited about rolling that out. That'll start in January, but you can sign up for information about it as soon as the landing page is up.
Oh, that's awesome. That is awesome. Well, look, Billy, this was a great conversation. I just want to thank you for taking some time to speak with me today. Like I said, I wanted to get some teachers in here. And so my shameless plug will be, if you know any more, let them know about the show, and I'd love to talk to them.
No, absolutely. I know teachers want to speak their mind on their COVID experience. So yes, they've got a lot to say.
I'll take it. I'll definitely take it. So look, it was a pleasure hearing, your story. I'd like for us to stay connected. And so would love for you to share, where can our listeners support you?
Yeah, if you want to go to www.mindfulmidlifecrisis.com, you can find all of our episodes there. You can contact us there. Sign up for our newsletter by clicking contact. We send out new meditations every single Sunday. We give you an opportunity to reflect on what you're grateful for and where your successes were and what your roadblocks were, but what you're also doing about those roadblocks. So you can find that in the newsletter. I use Instagram prolifically, so go to mindful_midlife_crisis and check us out there. If you're curious what life was like in Portugal or in Korea or in Puerto Vallarta, I've got all sorts of pictures there for you. I love the travel plan. In fact, my dream would be to either be a tour guide or someone who writes up itineraries for your travel experience. And I would gladly do that. So you can DM me on Instagram at mindful_midlife_crisis, or you can email me at mindfulmidlifecrisis@gmail.com. Send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. I'm curious. Let me know if you decide to listen to any of the episodes, or if you look at it and you're like, dude, you got 70 episodes. I don't know where to start. I will send you a starter pack. In fact, start with episode 19, Compassionate Communication for Deeper, More Meaningful Relationships with Dr. Yvette Erasmus, because when we got done talking to her, Brian and I looked at each other like, what just happened? That was the most amazing conversation of our lives. So you can start there and then find any other topics that appeal to you as well. And, a lot of us who are in midlife are transitioning out of careers. And Brian, you and I talked about having you come on the show and talk about what you're learning about why people are leaving their jobs, because I think that would resonate with our audience as well. So looking forward to having you on the show.
Absolutely. And I'm definitely going to go check out that episode as well. I love hearing things like that. All right. So look, that'll do it for today. Just want to again thank my guest, Billy Lahr, for joining me. I'll be sure to share all this information in our show notes. And so I hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Billy, good seeing you.
Nice seeing you too. Take it easy, everybody.
Thanks again for listening to Why I Left. Be sure to join us next time for more stories from the Great Resignation. Visit us at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co. And subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.